Hey there everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Daki and I'd like to welcome everyone back to this week's episode of Daki Time. So before we get quickly into the video and the question that's been asked this week, I'd like to say a huge shout out to everyone on my Discord page and everyone that's supporting me through Patreon. You guys are making it so cool for me to make these videos and I'm really happy making these videos week in, week out. Guys, all the questions up on my request tab and Discord page, keep them coming because I really like seeing these questions. I really am trying to get in and answer as many as I can, so keep them coming, guys. Now, if you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing because it is the most direct way of supporting me on this channel. Alright, so with all that said and out of the road, let's get into this week's episode. So this week's episode comes from is a question that comes from Redem. Now Redem asks this: a few Daki Time episodes ago, you talked about overtunement of dungeons regarding affixes. I cannot remember if you talked about it in any of your other videos, but which raids do you think are overtuned and which do you think they could have made a bit more difficult? So if I was just to talk about the Legion and BFA raids, because they're the most fresh in my mind, then a few do sort of come to my opinion, some would come to my brain basically, that some were just a little bit harder than others, but overall they were pretty similar. So when it comes to Legion, let me start by addressing that put together, all the raids are really, really well spaced out, they're really well structured, the art style of them, they're really, really well put together. But first one I believe is really like above and beyond is the Emerald Nightmare. Now the structure of Emerald Nightmare, the way it's spaced out, means that you can go to any boss except for say the last 2 or 3, and each one of those bosses is relatively the same difficulty, and you can do them in whatever order, and that overall makes the raid tuned pretty damn well, except for the last 2, which generally are harder than the others. And obviously they ramp up. I would also like to say that the Nighthold and Tomb of Sargeras, like the Emerald Nightmare, were put together really, really well and don't have massive barriers to overcome. So you don't get to a point where one boss is significantly harder than the other and thus making it overtuned. Every boss felt like a progressive increase in difficulty until you reached the end bosses. Now Taurus was a little bit different because again put together really well, and it was such a good raid to go and fight in. But this raid had a few bosses that did require a bit of thinking, and overall I believe that Taurus was definitely a step up in other Legion raids. This would make sense as it was the last raid in that expansion. Now overall, did I think that Taurus was more overtuned than say the Emerald Nightmare or any of those other raids in Legion? In a way, yes, a little bit, but it had to be being the last expansion of the last raid of the expansion. So it felt like a step up, but did it feel overtuned? No. And what I mean by this is that you could progress through the raid relatively at a steady pace and not hit an obstacle or a barrier or a boss that just halted you in your tracks. Sorry. So if I was to think of BFA right now, we've only got 3 raids out at the moment, and just tackling those 3 raids as they are, they're so very, very close together as how hard they really feel. Believe it or not, you know, these raids such as Uldia was hard in the sense that, say, Zul or a couple of the bosses were really difficult, and that did make it a little bit more challenging. But was that the dungeon as an overall overtunement? No. Was Zul a little bit overtuned, or was Gahun a little bit overtuned? In ways, yes, but you got to understand that the last couple of bosses of every raid need to be a step up from the other bosses. They need to be progressively increased in difficulty, basically, or there's no point in just having a linear raid. It would just be over in 2 seconds and you're done. Now, Battle for Dazara Law has the same sort of feel. You progress through and you're doing fairly well until you hit the last couple of bosses, when then all of a sudden there's an increase in difficulty and an increase in skill. Now, overall, does that make the raid difficult or overtuned? No. Not necessarily. When you compare Uldia and Battle for Dazara Law, I believe that they are much of a muchness, as difficult or as easy as each other, really. One is not overtuned compared to the other, and those 2 raids are not overtuned compared to every single raid that Blizzard has ever put out. Sure, there are hard bosses in every single raid, but that does not make the overall raid overtuned as such, because it is counteracted with extremely easy bosses. Say the council fight at the beginning of Battle of Desire Law, such an easy fight on both normal and heroic. Now, I haven't seen Mythic, but I've heard it is a pushover, really. So that is counteracted with, say, Stormwall, which is quite difficult in comparison. Now, balancing those out does not make the raid overtuned. So I'm rambling on, but overall, I believe that the Battle for Azeroth dungeons are quite the raids are quite put together quite well at the moment. One is not significantly more overtuned. I just think that the bosses inside there are a little bit harder than normal. Now, if I was to think back on past raids and expansion, what comes to mind as being overtuned as such? Now, I've only been a heroic raider. I've never really done mythic, so I can't comment on mythic difficulty. But I do remember spending a lot of time in Bastion of Twilight and Throne of the Four Winds. Again, if I looked back, Throne of the Four Winds only had 2 bosses, realistically. Now, was the overall raid overtuned? Maybe a touch, but it was a filler raid, and filler raids generally are more difficult than, say, your normal progression raids. So Throne of the Four Winds was probably a little bit more overtuned for the expansion that it was in. Bastion of Twilight, again, I remember spending a lot of time in Bastion of Twilight, so if I was to think back, overall, was the raid overtuned for the level that you were at? Maybe a little bit, but you got to understand that these obstacles or overtunement of the raids are very easy to overcome, and eventually, obviously, as normal, everyone gets the bosses done and the raid done as well. So if I could pick a raid that could be improved upon and made easier overall, maybe Battle for Desire Law. I think there are more bosses in there that make the raid overall harder or a little bit more challenging than any other raid that I can remember up to a point. But again, Battle for Desire Law is not completely overtuned. Just some bosses in that raid in particular. So that is it, guys. Very quick Daki time this week. Dog is barking again, that dog. But long story short, guys, I don't believe that any raid is completely overtuned as such for your level. It is a progressive increase in difficulty from raid to raid, and also, if you think about it, inside the raid going through the bosses. So the further you move through the expansion, and if we're talking about Battle for Azeroth right now, the next raid that's going to incorporate Azshara should be a little bit harder and a little bit more difficult than, say, Uldia. It's natural progression. We're fighting harder and harder bosses. Thus, the end of Battle for Azeroth, let's say for argument's sake we deal with N'Zoth. N'Zoth should not be easier than the, Zul or G'huun. He should be harder than Zul and G'huun. So technically, overtunement of raids is a very hard thing to sort of nut down and bolt down, because if you thought about it in that manner, then yes, the last raid in Battle for Azeroth would be harder than Uldia. Does that mean it's overtuned? No, I don't believe so. But I do agree with one thing here, Redemp, and that is bosses are overtuned. If you look at Battle for Desire Law right now, you hit sort of like 2 stages. One at sort of Stormwall and one sort of right at Jaina, right at the end of the Battle for Desire Law, where it becomes hard and harder again. And I think they're 2 stages that you sort of you hit, basically. So bosses inside of raids absolutely are a bit overtuned, but raids overall, I personally don't think that there's a completely overtuned raid in World of Warcraft at the moment. So guys, I hope that has answered your questions. Redemp, I hope that sort of covered it. I know it didn't go into a lot of specifics. I do apologize. If you want more specifics, please hit me up in another question in my request tab, because what I can do then is I can break down, say, a raid, or I can break down 2 or 3 raids rather than talking about every single raid in World of Warcraft. But thank you all so much for coming and watching this video. Keep subscribed to this YouTube channel, because it's the only way you guys are going to keep up to date, and it's the best way of supporting me as a creator. And until next time, everyone, have a great day.